I know a lot of you have mild cases of hypertension. At least now you know. Good morning, friends. In this video, I'm going to tell you exactly how doctors go about managing people's hypertension, that is high blood pressure. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video to help the channel's growth. Now let's get started. First of all, I wanted to tell you the reason I'm making this video. I received a comment from a subscriber recently inquiring about how he should go about managing his hypertension given that he's already taking one medication, the medication that I prefer, called an ARB. What should he do next? I tried to respond to the subscriber on the comment section, but I thought it could be useful for other people to know how doctors normally go about deciding the kinds of medications they'll use to manage someone's hypertension. So let's get started on that. First of all, I want you guys to know that there are very genetic causes for hypertension. There are polymorphisms that could affect someone's expression of catecholamines. Those are neurotransmitters similar to dopamine, such as noradrenaline or adrenaline. If somebody has higher adrenaline levels naturally, they're likely to be slightly more hypertensive. Tensive, by the way, refers to the condition of your vascular structure, the blood vessels contraction. Hypertensive means you're extremely tensive, you're contracted, whereas hypotensive means you're too little contracted in your blood vessels. So if somebody has higher adrenaline levels naturally, they're more likely to have more contracted blood vessels. But the same is true if somebody naturally retains more salt. Because if they retain more salt due to some kind of mineralocorticoid receptor activity, which could be genetic, they may hold more fluid and therefore have more blood volume in total across the same vascular structure, which would make the blood vessels have to contract more because there's more fluid in them. There's other polymorphisms that could affect this too. There are so many that there's over a couple of dozen in my cardiovascular section for my genetic analysis, which eventually will be automated, and hopefully you guys can learn more about why you specifically may be predisposed toward hypertension. But there are polymorphisms involved in the angiotensin converting enzyme ACE gene. There are polymorphisms related potentially to the angiotensin receptor itself, like AT1, that could cause AT1 to have more activity or be more functional. So there are a lot of ways in which you could develop hypertension, and it's polygenic and they affect each other. So it's an interactive effect of many different variables. So it's not that one would go to their genetics and clearly see, oh, this is why I'm hypertensive. It's clearly a sodium retention issue. It's never going to be that clear. You're going to have other predisposing variants, and we don't know exactly how much each of them contribute yet. Also, I should mention actually before we continue that inflammation can be a reason that your blood vessels are contracted. If you have systemic inflammation, your blood vessels will be more likely to contract as well. But moving on, what's the first step that a doctor usually takes? A medical doctor will usually begin with a drug from the class of angiotensin receptor blockers. Those are ARBs, or ACE inhibitors. ACE inhibitors basically work at a higher level of the process that people are trying to inhibit. They work at a higher level, and therefore they're less selective. They block the system maybe potentially more potently, but they're less selective over the effect. Specifically, what happens when you use an ACE inhibitor is that you inhibit this activity of the enzyme completely, thereby reducing signaling at two receptors, the angiotensin 1 receptor AT1 and the angiotensin 2 receptor AT2. AT2 doesn't actually have an impact on blood vessel contraction. It's not very useful to block. On the other hand, AT2 has some pro-growth effects in the body. So if you don't block AT2 and you only block AT1, you increase technically the proportion of signal and maybe the total signal at AT2. This can be helpful for healing, for your brain health, for growth in the body, but could be potentially worse for cancers. So sometimes ACE inhibitors, which block both of these, will reduce cancer incidence a bit more than ARBs. But at the same time, ARBs can be protective for other reasons because they block specifically the AT1 receptor, allowing the AT2 receptor to have action. If you want the AT2 receptor's action, ARBs will always be superior. So ARBs are more downstream to ACE inhibitors and may be more useful for certain people, though they are less of a sledgehammer approach. I would start with an ARB personally unless I was particularly predisposed to cancer, in which case I may start with an ACE inhibitor like ramipril. The point is, first the doctor will start a patient on either an ACE inhibitor or an ARB. They'll usually select one that seems to have particular effectiveness. For example, they may select ramipril among the ACE inhibitors. They may not select something like losartan, among the ARBs. Losartan is one of the first ARBs to be introduced. Doctors will usually only prescribe it if they are not very familiar with the medications themselves and don't realize it is inferior in all contexts to other ARBs. They may instead pick something like valsartan, the most selective ARB on the AT1 receptor, or they may pick something like telmisartan, which has a pleiotropic effect, being a PPAR gamma agonist. PPAR is a receptor that modulates metabolic function and insulin sensitivity. The point is, they'll first pick one of these drugs at a moderate dose. And then if the person's hypertension is not resolved, that means if the person's blood pressure does not reach an average of about 120/80. In my experience, I personally prefer to aim for something like 115/80 at rest, so that in stressful states I am just slightly above 125 or so. But at the very least, you don't want your systolic blood pressure to be over 125. At that point, it's known that inflammation at the blood vessel wall, which is due to the hypertension, causes damage to the blood vessels, initiating the steps of cardiovascular disease. So if the doctor is unable to get the blood pressure to be about 125/80 using the dose that they chose, they will ramp up the dose of that same medication till they get to the maximal therapeutic dose of that medication. If that isn't successful, they'll move on to a more effective medication in that class of medications and then move to the max dose of that medication. So for example, if a doctor chose valsartan, they may start with 80 milligrams. If that was insufficient, they may move to 120 milligrams. If that was insufficient, they may go to the max dose, which is 160 milligrams. If that was insufficient, they may move to azilsartan, which is more effective at its max dose. Now, say the doctor has reached the max dose of azilsartan, or the maximally powerful drug in this class of drugs. What should the doctor do next? In fact, actually, before that happens, just to note, some doctors will not go to the maximal dose before introducing a beta blocker, because beta blockers are so protective on the heart. If you have a slightly high resting heart rate, usually a doctor will consider introducing a beta, well, they'll consider advising you to exercise first. If that doesn't do it, then they may add a beta blocker at a lower dose of the ARB or ACE inhibitor before they escalate the dose, because they specifically want to lower your heart rate as well. But say the doctor has used azilsartan, gotten to the max dose, and not used a beta blocker yet. What will the doctor do next? The doctor will usually examine you. If you appear to be holding more water or fluid than you naturally do, the doctor may lean towards beginning with a diuretic in combination with the ACE inhibitor or ARB. If your heart rate remains elevated, although you're hypertensive, which by the way is not natural, usually when the blood vessel contracts, your heart has to beat less beats per minute to get the blood moved around properly. So if you still have a high resting heart rate at a higher blood pressure, it's indicative of something going wrong in your body, and it's indicative that the heart rate may worsen the development of pathologies in your heart. So the doctor may look at these two competing interests and decide on one class of medications to begin in addition to the former one. So they may start with a diuretic like hydrochlorothiazide, or they may start with a beta blocker like atenolol or nebivolol. Nebivolol has unique effects on expanding the blood vessel walls because of its effect on nitric oxide. But anyway, they're going to pick one of those usually, maybe try a slightly higher dose of it, and then potentially consider using the other one. So they'll be, unless you have a low heart rate, they'll usually consider a beta blocker and potentially a diuretic. And then if neither of those approaches work, they may consider adding a calcium channel blocker, an older class of medications that's usually now used only if it's needed. They may consider using a calcium channel blocker as a third step after already looking at blood pressure and the diuretic effect. They may consider a calcium channel blocker, and if they do so there, I should mention that, sorry, I was just thinking about this. I should mention that they shouldn't do so before they've evaluated whether the patient is consuming enough magnesium. Magnesium is your body's natural calcium channel blocker, and if you add another calcium channel blocker, you'll have a lower tolerance for the amount of magnesium you can consume. So you first have to make sure the person is sufficient in magnesium consumption, and then consider adding a calcium channel blocker. So those are the steps. They begin with an ARB or an ACE inhibitor. Then, if your heart rate is still elevated, they may consider adding a beta blocker, but if not, they will eventually raise the dose and switch to the most effective medication in that class, before considering either a beta blocker or a diuretic. And if those all don't work, they may consider adding a calcium channel blocker. I hope this was helpful for you, friends. I know a lot of you have mild cases of hypertension. At least now you know how doctors approach the selection of drugs combined together to treat that hypertension. It's not necessarily genetically based, but through trial and error and through the symptoms that you exhibit. I hope this was helpful for you again, friends. I look forward to seeing you again this afternoon.